Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into something pretty major happening in global trade.
Yeah, a really significant policy change. The U.S. has substantially increased tariffs on imported steel and aluminum again.
Exactly. And it's stirring things up.
Yeah.
We've gathered quite a bit of material for this news report's economic analyses.
Right. We've got CTV News, NPR for the news side, then economic takes from places like the Brookings Institution, the Tax Foundation.
Details on how other countries are reacting from Global Policy Watch, and even, a glimpse of market chatter from a Reddit thread.
So the goal here is to unpack it all. What are these tariffs really? Why now? What do the sources say about the economic effects, the international response?
And maybe most importantly, what it could all mean for you.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The immediate news, the core event here is the decision to, double down on existing Section 232 tariffs.
Doubled, yeah. That's the headline. We're talking about steel and aluminum imports.
Correct. The rate, which was already significant, has been hiked from 25% up to 50%.
50%? Wow. And this happened fast, didn't it? Effective June 4th, 2025.
Very quickly. No long phase-in. And predictably, the reaction from key trading partners was pretty much instantaneous.
CTV News highlighted Canada's response straight away. They weren't pleased.
Not at all. Called the tariffs unlawful and unjustified. Strong words right out of the gate.
Now, this whole situation probably feels a bit like déjà vu for people following trade news. It's not the first time we've seen these specific tariffs.
Absolutely. This builds on what happened during the first Trump administration back in 2018.
Right. That's when these Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum first came into play.
Yeah, though the initial rates were lower than Investopedia, and the Tax Foundation remind us it was 25% on steel, but only 10% on aluminum back then.
And Investopedia made an interesting point that those earlier tariffs almost became like a live experiment for economists.
Exactly. They provided real-world data, a test case, they called it, to actually study the effects, which is informing the analyses we're looking at now for this bigger increase.
Okay, so before we get into those effects, what were the stated reasons for doing this, according to the sources? Why impose these tariffs?
Well, the administration gives a few main justifications. Number one is usually national security.
The argument being a strong domestic steel industry is vital for defense, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Then there's the goal of directly helping American workers, in those specific industries.
Steel workers, aluminum workers.
Right. And also using tariffs as a tool, like leverage, in bigger trade negotiations.
Okay, those are the stated goals. But do the sources suggest they actually achieve those things?
That's where it gets complex. Sources like Brookings, for instance, they raise questions. They suggest these Section 232 tariffs haven't been particularly effective at, say, forcing better trade deals or even substantially bolstering national security in the way Cox claimed.
Interesting. Which brings us to the economic impact. What does the data actually show happened with the earlier tariffs and what might happen now? This is where Brookings and the Tax Foundation really dig in.
And a key finding, really consistent across these analyses, is about who actually pays for the tariffs.
You mean it's not necessarily the foreign companies selling this stuff?
Largely, no. Brookings puts it pretty bluntly. American firms and consumers end up bearing the vast majority of the cost.
How does that work? The Tax Foundation studies mention costs getting passed through.
Yeah, exactly. The tariffs raise the price of imported steel and aluminum for the U.S. companies buying it, and those higher costs tend to get passed down the supply chain, often showing up in the prices consumers pay for finished goods.
So higher costs for businesses that use steel and aluminum, like manufacturers.
Definitely. Think about anyone making cars, appliances, construction materials, even food cans. NPR had a good example with cans.
Right. If aluminum costs more for the can maker.
They charge more for the cans, then the food or drink company using those cans faces higher costs.
And then we end up paying more for, say, soup or soda.
Exactly. It ripples through. NPR even called it a potential lose-lose for American consumers because prices go up.
Okay, so higher prices are one impact. What about jobs? Because that's often presented as a primary reason for tariffs protecting American jobs.
It is. And the analysis here is, nuanced. There is evidence the tariffs help some workers.
In the steel and aluminum industries themselves.
Yes. Brookings and Investopedia note that the earlier tariffs did seem to create some jobs, maybe several thousand or 1,000 extra, specifically in those sectors competing directly with imports.
Okay, so a positive effect there.
Yeah.
But is that the whole story on jobs?
No, definitely not. The sources stress you have to look at the net effect across the whole economy, because while those jobs were created, other jobs were lost.
Lost where?
In industries that use steel and aluminum, think manufacturing jobs, downstream cars, equipment, packaging, all those sectors facing higher material costs. And also jobs in exporting industries that get hit when other countries retaliate with their own tariffs against U.S. goods.
And were those losses significant?
Some estimates suggest they were much larger than the gains. NPR mentioned studies estimating tens of thousands of downstream manufacturing jobs lost during the previous tariff round.
Wow, tens of thousands.
And a 2019 study cited by the Tax Foundation found an overall net decrease in manufacturing employment. It makes a bit more sense when you consider the numbers involved.
How so?
Well, the Tax Foundation pointed to a 2018 analysis showing that jobs in industries using steel outnumbered jobs producing steel by a huge margin, something like 80-1.
80-1. So hurting those user industries impacts way more workers.
Potentially, yes. A small percentage loss in those big sectors can easily outweigh gains in the smaller producing sector.
Okay, so net job impact looks negative according to these analyses.
Hmm.
What about the overall economy, like GDP growth?
The general consensus among economists cited in these sources is that trade barriers like tariffs tend to shrink the economic pie overall. They reduce output and income.
Does the Tax Foundation put a number on that?
They do. Their estimate is that these Section 232 tariffs alone could reduce long-run U.S. GDP by about 0.2%.
And that's just these specific tariffs.
Right. When they factor in other tariffs the administration has imposed, some of which have faced legal challenges we can maybe touch on later, their estimate of the total drag from U.S.-imposed tariffs rises to around 0.6% of GDP.
And you also have to account for retaliation, right? Other countries hitting back.
Absolutely. When you add in the estimated impact of foreign retaliation against U.S. exports, the Tax Foundation's model suggests the combined effect could reduce U.S. GDP by around 0.9%.
Almost a full percentage point of GDP. That's quite substantial over time.
It represents a significant amount of lost economic activity, yeah. Hundreds of billions, potentially.
So how does this translate down to, say, individual households? And what about government revenue?
The Tax Foundation analysis estimates a direct hit to household incomes. They project tariffs reducing average household market income by about 1.1% in 2026.
And they frame that as like a tax increase?
Sort of, yeah. They calculate an equivalent average cost per household around $11,483 extra in 2025, rising to $445 in 2026. And they caution that this might even understate the true cost.
Why understate it?
Because it mainly captures the direct tariff costs and income effects, maybe not fully accounting for things like less consumer choice or price increases on goods that aren't tariffed but become more expensive because demand shifts. So a noticeable impact on family budgets.
Okay, but on the flip side, the government collects the tariff money, right? That's revenue.
It is. The Tax Foundation estimates these tariffs could bring in about $156.4 billion in federal revenue in 2025, based on a simple calculation. They actually highlighted this, calling it potentially the largest tax hike since 1993 on that static basis.
But wait, you said the economy might shrink. Doesn't that affect revenue too?
Exactly. That's the dynamic estimate. When they factor in the negative impact on GDP and overall incomes, the net revenue gain is lower because other tax collections, like income tax, fall a bit due to the slower economy. So it's not quite as much of a windfall when you look at the whole picture.
Okay, let's shift gears to the international reaction. We heard about Canada. What about other major players like the EU?
Very similar response. Global Policy Watch detailed the EU's reaction. They also view the tariffs as unlawful and unjustified and are prepping swift and proportionate countermeasures. They're not messing around.
And they're being specific about what they'll do.
Oh, yeah. They plan to bring back tariffs they had imposed back in 2018 and 2020 on U.S. goods, which had been suspended as part of negotiations.
Weren't those tariffs strategically targeted?
Very much so.
Yeah.
They covered about $8 billion worth of U.S. exports to the EU back then, hitting products like bourbon, motorbikes, boats, things chosen for maximum political pressure in certain U.S. regions.
Designed to get attention, basically.
Definitely. And on top of reinstating those, the EU is planning new tariffs under a different EU regulation, potentially hitting another $18 billion worth of U.S. exports.
So $8 billion plus $18 billion. That's $26 billion in U.S. goods potentially facing EU countermeasures.
That's the scale they're talking about, yes.
Yeah.
Big numbers.
But are they closing the door on talks?
No, the sources indicate the EU explicitly stated they're still willing to seek a negotiated solution. They prefer to resolve it without the tit-for-tat tariffs, it seems.
What's been the response from the U.S. side to these threats of retaliation?
Well, President Trump has made counter-threats. The EU's source mentioned talk of potentially hitting EU products like wine and spirits with tariffs as high as 200%.
200%. That would be massive.
It would. And this escalating rhetoric has businesses really worried. Industry executives mentioned concerns that the auto sector could be next in the crosshairs.
All this back and forth must create huge uncertainty for businesses trying to plan.
Absolutely. That NPR quote from a manufacturer summed it up perfectly. Something like, how can we plan when the rules might change tomorrow? That instability is a major headache.
And adding to the complexity, there are legal challenges swirling around some of these trade actions, right?
Yeah, that's another layer. The Tax Foundation mentioned that U.S. courts have actually ruled against the administration on other tariffs, not the steel and aluminum ones based on Section 232, but ones imposed using a different law, the IEEPA.
So, separate legal cases, but related to trade authority.
Right. The administration is appealing those rulings, but it just shows the legal ground for some of these broad tariff actions is being contested, adding to the overall uncertainty, even if it doesn't directly stop these specific steel tariffs right now.
Okay, finally, let's look at the market angle. That Reddit thread you mentioned, what are everyday investors thinking or saying about this?
It gives you a sense of the speculation and the differing strategies. Some people in the thread clearly think domestic steel and aluminum companies are the obvious winners here.
They name names.
Yeah. Tickers like X for U.S. Steel, CENX for Century Aluminum, NUE for Nucor, STLD for Steel Dynamics, the usual suspects expected to benefit from import protection.
But not everyone was jumping on that bandwagon.
No. Others were much more cautious. Some called trying to trade specifically on tariff news gambling just because it's so unpredictable and politically driven, not like analyzing company fundamentals.
Did they mention downsides? Industries getting hurt.
Yes, definitely. People pointed to the auto sector, again GM, Ford noting their stocks seem to be reacting negatively, likely due to the higher metal costs these tariffs imply for them.
Any other interesting takes or strategies mentioned?
Some suggested just ignoring the noise and sticking with stocks with strong underlying businesses. Others thought maybe brokerage stocks could do well if all this uncertainty leads to more market volatility in trading.
Kind of a meta play on the uncertainty itself.
Exactly. And one user made the point that for companies like U.S. Steel, the big stock price jump already happened back when the first tariffs hit in 2018, suggesting maybe the obvious upside is already baked in for some.
So a real mix of opinions and strategies out there. No clear consensus, which reflects the uncertainty.
Pretty much. It highlights how tough it is for investors to price in these kinds of policy shocks and their ripple effects.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, pulling together what we've seen across these sources, it paints a really complicated picture, doesn't it?
It really does. You have these tariffs implemented with stated goals like protecting specific domestic industries.
But they immediately trigger strong opposition, retaliation threats from major trading partners like Canada and the EU.
And then the economic analyses we looked at, from Brookings, Tax Foundation, others, they document significant costs. Costs borne largely by domestic firms and consumers.
Yeah, showing up as higher prices, hurting businesses that use these metals, leading to complex and, according to some studies, overall negative impacts on jobs when you look beyond just steel and aluminum production.
Plus, a measurable drag on overall economic growth, hitting household incomes, even if it does bring in some government revenue initially. And all the while, the markets are trying to figure out what it all means amidst the uncertainty.
What strikes me is just how interconnected everything is.
Right.
A policy aimed at one specific area
Ends up sending ripples, often unintended ones, across the entire economy, domestically and globally. It really shows you can't easily isolate one part of the trade picture.
It definitely leaves us with something to think about. When you look at the evidence presented in these sources, the potential job gains in steel versus the documented net losses in broader manufacturing, the tariff revenue versus the estimated cost to your household budget, and the hit to GDP.
It raises that fundamental question for you listening. How do you weigh those costs and benefits against each other? And considering all these different impacts we've discussed, who do you think ultimately shoulders the biggest burden from these kinds of trade policies?